The gate agent's voice sliced through the terminal, sharp and loud, carrying farther than it should have. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside, right now." Conversations around gate C12 slowed, then stopped. Rolling suitcases clicked once, then went silent. Heads turned. A woman stood frozen in front of the boarding scanner, her ticket still in her hand, her shoulders stiff as if bracing for impact. Margaret Lewis did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply inhaled, slowly, as though she had learned long ago that breath was the only thing no one could take from her. She was 54 years old, though the fine lines around her eyes made her look older to those who only saw age when it came wrapped in dark skin and gray threaded hair. She wore a navy cardigan over a plain white blouse, slacks pressed carefully the night before, sensible shoes polished but unremarkable. Nothing about her announced power. Nothing about her demanded attention. And yet, the tension gathering around her felt heavy, almost electric, like a storm waiting for permission to break. Behind the counter, the agent avoided Margaret's eyes. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unmoving, as if the machine itself might absolve her of what she was about to do. "There's an issue with your seat assignment," the agent said, too quickly. "We need to verify a few things." Margaret glanced at the departure screen above them. San Francisco, on time, business class boarding in progress. She had arrived early, like she always did, out of habit formed during decades of hospital shifts where lateness cost lives. Her conference badge rested inside her purse, next to neatly folded documents and a small photograph she carried everywhere. A younger version of herself stood in that picture. White coat too big, smile unsure but proud. "I've already checked in," Margaret said quietly. Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who had spent years delivering bad news without breaking. Everything was verified at the desk. The agent's jaw tightened. "We just need a moment." A moment stretched. Then another. The scanner beeped behind Margaret as another passenger attempted to board and was waved around her, directed to a different lane. A man in a tailored blazer glanced at Margaret, then away, as if contact might be contagious. A woman with silver hair clutched her handbag tighter, eyes flicking from Margaret's face to her shoes and back again. Margaret felt it then. Not anger, not yet. Something older, heavier. The familiar weight of being examined without consent, judged without evidence. She had felt it in hospital hallways when patients asked if she was the nurse. She had felt it at charity galas when donors spoke past her, assuming her role before hearing her name. She had learned to carry it like a second spine. The agent finally cleared her throat. "There may have been a mix-up," she said. "Your seat is under review." Under review. The words hung there, vague and dangerous. Margaret's fingers tightened around the paper boarding pass. She could feel the eyes on her now, openly curious, quietly satisfied. A ripple of discomfort moved through the gate area, the kind people felt when something unpleasant happened to someone else, and they were relieved it was not happening to them. "Is there a problem?" Margaret asked. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, held the agent's face. The agent hesitated, then gestured to the side. "Please, wait over there." Margaret stepped aside. Her shoes made a soft sound against the polished floor. She stood near a pillar, away from the boarding line, away from the flow of bodies moving forward. She watched passengers scan their tickets and disappear down the jet bridge, watched their relief as the scanner flashed green. Every beep felt like a door closing. A man in a windbreaker leaned toward his wife and whispered something. She nodded without looking at Margaret. Somewhere behind her, a child asked a question and was quickly shushed. The airport hummed on, indifferent, efficient, practiced at swallowing moments like this without choking. Margaret lowered her gaze, just for a second, and focused on the rhythm of her breathing. In out. She could feel her pulse in her wrists. She thought of the morning she had left Detroit, the sky still dark, the hospital quiet except for the low beeping of monitors. She had finished a 12-hour shift, hands steady through exhaustion, mind sharp through fatigue. She had saved a man's life before dawn and walked out of the hospital without applause, without witnesses, because that was the work. You did it because it mattered, not because anyone thanked you. Footsteps approached. Margaret looked up. A supervisor stood in front of her now, older than the agent, his badge clipped slightly crooked, his mouth already pulled into a line of practiced authority. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask how she was doing. "Ma'am," he said, voice firm but distant. "There's a concern regarding your booking." Margaret nodded once. What concern? He glanced at the boarding pass in her hand, then at her face, then back at the paper. His eyes lingered just a fraction too long on her hair, on the faint silver at her temples. "This is a premium cabin ticket," he said. "Yes." He cleared his throat. "And did you purchase this ticket yourself?" There it was, the question that always came dressed as procedure. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, subtle but sharp. She did not bristle. She did not smile. "It was purchased by the conference organizers," she said. "I'm a scheduled speaker." The supervisor's eyebrows lifted, barely. "We'll need to confirm that." Margaret held his gaze. "Confirm it with whom?" He did not answer directly. Instead, he gestured toward a tablet held by the agent nearby. "Please remain here." Remain here. Again. As they turned away, Margaret caught the agent's whisper, not meant for her, but not careful enough to hide. "We've had issues before." Issues. Always plural, always vague. Margaret closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She thought of the conference waiting for her on the other side of the country, of the lecture hall filled with colleagues who knew her work, who had read her research, who would listen when she spoke. She thought of the irony that she would spend the next few days discussing equity in healthcare while standing here, reduced to a question mark. The boarding announcement echoed again. "Final call for business class passengers." Margaret stood alone as the last of them disappeared. The gate area thinned. The energy shifted. The moment stretched longer than it should have, long enough for something irreversible to settle in. She did not know it yet, but this pause, this silence, this manufactured doubt, would ripple outward in ways no one at gate C12 could control. The cameras above, blinking red, captured everything. The glances, the delay, the quiet humiliation dressed up as policy. And somewhere in the airport, a man with silver hair and an immaculate posture checked his watch, unaware that the woman he loved was being quietly erased, one procedural step at a time. The jet bridge door closed with a hollow thud, sealing Margaret on the wrong side of forward motion. Gate C12 was nearly empty now, its early attention replaced by a sterile quiet that felt worse than the stairs. The supervisor returned, tablet in hand, his expression unchanged, professional to the point of indifference. He did not apologize for the delay. He did not explain the process. He simply looked at her as if she were a file that had failed to load. "There's a discrepancy," he said. Margaret waited. Silence was often more revealing than protest. She watched his eyes flick left, then right, calculating the room. The agent hovered a few steps back, arms folded tight against her chest, jaw set like a locked door. "What discrepancy?" Margaret asked. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Your ticket reflects a corporate allocation. We need to verify the source." "I already told you the source." "Yes, ma'am. We still need to verify it." Margaret nodded once. She could feel the heat behind her eyes. the slow burn of something she had learned not to name until it was safe. She reached into her purse and removed a folded letter, the paper worn soft at the creases. She held it out without flourish. "Here's the confirmation email," she said. "The name of the conference, the contact information, the seating code." He took it, scanned quickly, then handed it back. His eyes did not soften. If anything, they hardened, as if confirmation only complicated matters. "Please wait," he said again. Margaret exhaled through her nose. She thought of her mother's voice years ago, low and steady at the kitchen table. "You don't have to make them comfortable, Maggie. You just have to stay upright." Margaret straightened her shoulders. The supervisor stepped away to make a call. His back turned, his voice dropped to a murmur. Margaret caught fragments. Corporate, allocation, risk. The words floated without anchors, bureaucratic enough to mean anything and nothing. Behind her, footsteps approached. A woman in her late 60s stopped near the pillar, her carry-on parked beside her leg like a loyal dog. She glanced at Margaret, then at the empty gate, then back again. Her lips pressed together. For a moment, it looked like she might say something. She didn't. The woman turned away and walked down the jet bridge, her shoes clicking with purpose. The sound echoed longer than it should have. The supervisor returned. He handed Margaret back her boarding pass, then did not move aside. "We're going to reassign your seat," he said, "just to be safe." Margaret felt the words land like a verdict. "Reassign it to where?" "Economy," he said, as if stating the weather. Margaret stared at him, not in disbelief, in recognition. She had seen this move before, dressed up in concern, justified by procedure. A soft demotion, a quiet correction. "I paid for business class," she said. He tilted his head. "You didn't personally pay for it. That doesn't make it invalid." He glanced toward the agent, then back at Margaret. "This will avoid further complications." Margaret felt something inside her finally push back. Not rage, resolve. "No," she said. The word was small, but it carried weight. The supervisor blinked, surprised. "No," he repeated. "No," Margaret said again. "You've verified the ticket. You've seen the documentation. I'm not moving." A pause. The air tightened. "Mom," he said, voice dropping a degree. "We're trying to help you." Margaret's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "You're trying to help yourselves." The agent shifted uncomfortably. "Sir," she murmured, "we're holding up." The supervisor lifted a hand. His eyes did not leave Margaret. "If you don't comply, we'll have to escalate." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then escalate." The word seemed to unnerve him. Escalation required accountability, documentation, witnesses. He stepped back. "Please remain here." Margaret remained. Minutes passed. 10, then 15. The boarding door reopened briefly as a maintenance worker exited, then closed again. Margaret stood alone with her thoughts, with the soft hum of the terminal, with the faint sense of being watched by something larger than the people in front of her. She thought of the photograph in her purse, of the young doctor she had been, of the oath she had taken, spoken aloud in a crowded hall. She had believed, back then, that institutions were imperfect but correctable. That fairness bent slowly toward those who stayed the course. Footsteps approached again. 2 men this time. One in a navy blazer, airline insignia pinned to the lapel. The other in a dark uniform with a badge that caught the light. Airport security. Not aggressive, not rushed, but present. The supervisor spoke first. "This passenger is refusing a seat reassignment." The security officer looked at Margaret. His gaze was measured, curious rather than hostile. "Ma'am?" Margaret met his eyes. My seat assignment was valid. They're trying to move me without cause. The officer turned to the supervisor. Is there a safety concern? The supervisor hesitated. Just a fraction. We need to ensure cabin harmony. Harmony. The word landed wrong. The officer nodded slowly. Has she been disruptive? No, the supervisor said quickly. Not yet. Margaret exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The officer considered them both, then spoke carefully. If there's no safety issue, I don't see grounds for enforcement. The supervisor's jaw tightened. This is an internal matter. Then handle it internally, the officer said, without security. He stepped back. The presence receded. The supervisor looked at Margaret, something like irritation flickering across his face. We'll allow you to board, he said, clipped. But if there are any issues. There won't be, Margaret said. He stepped aside. Margaret walked down the jet bridge alone. The narrow corridor swallowed sound, the walls closing in. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the distance carried weight. She reached the aircraft door, where a flight attendant stood with a practiced smile that faltered when she saw Margaret's face. Welcome aboard, the attendant said, then glanced at the boarding pass. Her smile tightened. Right this way. Margaret entered the cabin. The air changed, softer, cooler, a different quiet. She moved through the rows, eyes following her like tracking lights. She reached her seat, last row of business class, by the lavatory, the least desirable place in a premium cabin. She sat. As she buckled her seatbelt, a man across the aisle watched her openly, his gaze lingering. He leaned toward the aisle, pressing his call button almost immediately. A flight attendant approached him, her tone warm. Yes, sir? He glanced at Margaret, then back at the attendant. Is there another seat available? Margaret closed her eyes. The engine noise rose, a low, steady growl. The plane began to move. Somewhere beyond the tarmac, beyond the terminal, beyond the assumptions layered quietly like sediment, consequences were already forming, unseen and inevitable. The plane leveled off with a muted shudder, the kind that traveled through the floor before it reached the ears. The seatbelt sign chimed once, polite and final. Around Margaret, the cabin exhaled. Jackets loosened, screens flickered on. The illusion of normalcy returned quickly, as it always did, because people preferred comfort over truth. The man across the aisle did not look at her again. His request had been granted quietly. A flight attendant had bent close to him, nodded, and minutes later guided him forward with an apologetic smile, murmuring about an unexpected opening. He did not thank Margaret. He did not meet her eyes. He simply vanished into first class, leaving behind the empty seat and a silence that felt intentional. Margaret remained where she was. She watched the choreography unfold with clinical clarity. Drink carts rolled. Voices softened. Laughter drifted from somewhere near the front. The flight attendants moved with efficiency, their motions practiced, their smiles selective. When the cart reached her row, it paused. Not long enough to offer anything, just long enough to acknowledge the space beside her. Then it moved on. Margaret waited. She counted breaths. She watched condensation slide down the plastic wall beside her seat, tracing slow, uneven paths. Her mouth felt dry. Not unbearably so, just enough to register. She pressed the call button once. The light blinked on. A small signal. A request that should have meant nothing more than water in a paper cup. No one came. 2 rows ahead, a woman raised her hand. A flight attendant appeared immediately, bending low, listening closely. Margaret watched the exchange from behind, invisible by design. The light above her seat stayed on, patient and accusing. After several minutes, Margaret pressed the button again. The light blinked off, then on. Still nothing. She did not feel angry. Not yet. What she felt was something colder. A quiet calculation. She had spent years in operating rooms where time mattered, where small delays meant consequences. She knew the difference between oversight and intent. This was intent. A flight attendant finally approached, not the one who had humped the others. This one was older, posture rigid, expression fixed in polite neutrality. She stopped just short of Margaret's row. "Yes?" she asked. "May I have some water?" Margaret said. Her voice was steady. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. The attendant glanced at the cart behind her, then back at Margaret. "We're between services." Margaret nodded. "Everyone else seems to have been served." The attendant's eyes flicked toward the aisle, then back again. "You'll have to wait." She turned before Margaret could respond. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. She felt the faint vibration of the engines beneath her feet. She reminded herself that she was not powerless, even if the moment demanded restraint. There was a difference between submission and patience. She chose patience, because patience, when documented, became evidence. Time passed differently in the air. Minutes stretched. The cabin dimmed slightly as the sun shifted. Margaret's throat burned now, faint but persistent. She pressed the call button a third time. The lead flight attendant appeared almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for the excuse. "Yes, ma'am?" Her tone was crisp, clipped, rehearsed. "I've requested water several times," Margaret said. "I haven't received any response." The woman's lips pressed together. "We're very busy." Margaret met her gaze. "So is everyone else." A flicker crossed the attendant's face. Annoyance quickly masked. "We'll get to you." "When?" Margaret asked. The question seemed to offend her. "Please be patient," she said. "We're trying to maintain a smooth service." Smooth. The word echoed strangely. Margaret nodded once. "I am being patient." The attendant leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Pressing the call button repeatedly disrupts the cabin." Margaret felt it then. The subtle shift, the reframing. She was no longer a neglected passenger. She was becoming a problem. "I pressed it because I was ignored," Margaret said quietly. The attendant straightened. "I'll note your concern." She walked away. Margaret's light remained on. Across the aisle, a man glanced at her, then looked away quickly, as if embarrassed by proximity. A woman nearby whispered something to her husband, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. The attention pressed in from all sides, quiet but relentless. Margaret sat still. Her posture did not change, but inside, something tightened. She had endured long nights in trauma wards, had held hands as machines went silent, had stood between families and grief. She knew endurance. She knew restraint. What she had never accepted was erasure. When the meal service began, the cart stopped at every seat. Choices were offered, questions asked, preferences honored. When it reached Margaret, the attendant did not ask. "Chicken," she said, placing the tray down harder than necessary. The container slid slightly, sauce sloshing against its edge. A thin line spilled onto the tray table. Margaret looked down at the mess, then up at the attendant. "May I have some napkins?" The attendant pointed vaguely. "Seat pocket." There were 2 thin napkins. Margaret used one to blot the spill, then folded it carefully, setting it aside. She used the second to wipe her hands. The stain remained, dark against the plastic surface. She pressed the call button again. This time, the light blinked on and off, as if uncertain whether it should exist. No one came. Margaret sat back. Her chest felt tight now, not from fear, but from the effort of containment. She could feel the eyes on her again, feel the narrative shifting, quietly, insidiously. Difficult, demanding, disruptive. She knew how this ended if she allowed it. When the lead attendant passed by again, Margaret spoke before she could move on. "I need water," she said, "and cleaning supplies for the spill." The attendant stopped, turned. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "You'll have to wait until we're done serving." "We've been done serving," Margaret said. The woman's voice cooled. "Lower your voice." Margaret did not raise it. She did not need to. The words landed anyway. A man 2 rows back sighed loudly. "Some people," he muttered. Margaret looked straight ahead. She felt the weight of decades press against her spine, of lessons learned the hard way, of moments when speaking up had cost her more than silence ever did. She reached into her purse and touched the edge of the folded letter inside. The confirmation. The proof. The truth that no one here wanted to acknowledge. She did not know it yet, but every ignored request, every clipped response, every turned back was being quietly recorded. Not just by cameras mounted overhead, but by something more enduring. Memory. And memory, once validated, had a way of dismantling systems that believed themselves untouchable. The aisle lights dimmed as the cabin settled into its cruising rhythm, the kind of low, humming quiet that made people forget where they were. Margaret did not forget. She sat upright, hands folded, eyes forward, cataloguing everything with the same precision she used in an operating room. The way the lead attendant glanced back at her row more often than necessary. The way 2 junior attendants leaned toward each other near the galley, their heads close, voices lowered, but not enough. "She keeps pressing the button," one of them said, not bothering to hide the irritation. The other shrugged. "Some people just don't know how to act up here." Margaret heard every word. She had not meant to. She had not leaned forward or strained. The sound simply carried, careless and confident, spoken by people who believed they were unchallengeable. A slow heat spread through her chest. Not explosive, controlled. The kind that warned of damage if left untreated. She waited until the aisle was clear, until the cart had rolled forward and the murmurs settled back into routine. Then she stood. The movement drew attention immediately. Chairs creaked. A man across the aisle paused mid-sip. Margaret stepped carefully toward the galley, one hand brushing the seat backs for balance as the plane shifted slightly. The lead attendant turned as Margaret approached, her body stiffening, her expression sharpening into something defensive before a word was spoken. "Ma'am," she said, blocking the narrow entrance. "Please return to your seat. I'd like to speak with you," Margaret said. "Now is not an appropriate time." Margaret met her eyes. "I've requested water 4 times. I've asked for assistance with a spill. I've been ignored. This is the appropriate time." The attendant's jaw tightened. She glanced behind her, toward the cockpit door, then back again. "You're disrupting service." Margaret felt a flicker of something almost like disbelief. "Standing here calmly is disrupting service," she said evenly. "But ignoring a passenger is not." The words hung between them. A beat. 2. The attendant stepped aside just enough to let Margaret into the galley, but her posture screamed control. A second attendant hovered nearby, younger, eyes darting, clearly uncomfortable. "We've had complaints," the lead attendant said. Margaret blinked. "Complaints about what?" "You've been pressing the call button repeatedly. You questioned my crew. You're creating tension." Margaret nodded slowly. "So requesting basic service is tension." The younger attendant shifted her weight, hands clasped too tightly. She did not speak. She did not leave. Her silence felt heavier than accusation. Margaret lowered her voice. "I have not raised my voice. I have not used inappropriate language. I have not interfered with any other passenger. I've asked for water." The lead attendant crossed her arms. "We expect a certain standard of behavior in this cabin." There it was. Not policy, not procedure. Standard. Margaret felt the word settle into her bones. She had spent a lifetime meeting standards set by people who never questioned whether those standards included her. "I am meeting every standard," Margaret said. "I'm seated. I'm quiet. I'm respectful." The attendant's eyes hardened. "Then act like it." For a brief moment, Margaret considered every possible response. The ones that would escalate, the ones that would satisfy the anger rising behind her ribs. She let them pass. "Bring me water," she said instead. Not a request, a statement. The lead attendant stared at her, then turned away sharply. "Go back to your seat." Margaret held her ground. "After you bring me water." The cabin felt suddenly smaller, tighter, a pressure change that had nothing to do with altitude. The lead attendant took a step closer, lowering her voice. "If you continue this behavior, I will document it. And when we land, I will involve security." Margaret's pulse jumped, sharp and sudden. The threat was calculated, clean, familiar. "Document whatever you like," Margaret said. Her voice did not shake. "I will do the same." The younger attendant inhaled sharply, as if surprised by the response. The lead attendant's eyes narrowed. "Return to your seat," she said again. Margaret did. As she walked back down the aisle, she felt eyes on her from every direction. Not sympathy, curiosity, judgment, relief that the spotlight had moved away from someone else. She sat, buckled her belt, folded her hands again. Her call light remained on. Minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and reassuring, welcoming passengers to cruising altitude. Margaret listened to the words with detached clarity. Safety, comfort, appreciation. She wondered how many people believed them. The lead attendant passed her row without looking. The light above Margaret's seat blinked, then went dark. No water came. Margaret stared at the seat back in front of her. She could feel her throat ache now, dry and raw. She swallowed carefully. She thought of the hospital again, of chart notes written late at night, of the importance of timelines, documentation, accuracy. She reached into her purse and took out her phone. She did not film. She did not photograph. She opened the Notes app and began to type. Times, names, descriptions, short sentences, factual, controlled. 15 minutes later, the lead attendant returned with 2 men in dark uniforms. Airport security. Not the same officers from the gate. These wore expressions of polite authority, trained to de-escalate while asserting presence. The lead attendant spoke first. "This passenger has been disruptive," she said. "We've received multiple complaints." One of the officers looked at Margaret. His eyes were sharp, assessing. "Ma'am?" Margaret stood slowly. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. "I've requested water and basic service. I've been ignored. When I asked to speak with the lead attendant, I was threatened." The officer glanced at the lead attendant. "Is that accurate?" "She confronted my crew," the attendant said quickly. "She refused to comply with instructions." Margaret shook her head once. "I complied with every instruction. I returned to my seat. I did not raise my voice." The second officer spoke up. "Did she pose a safety risk?" The lead attendant hesitated, just a breath too long. "Not directly." The first officer nodded. "Then this is a customer service issue." The attendant stiffened. "We are responsible for cabin order, and we're responsible for safety," the officer said. "If there's no safety concern, we won't intervene." He turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, please remain seated for now. If there's a formal report, it will be addressed after landing." Margaret nodded. "Thank you." The officers stepped back. The lead attendant's face flushed, anger bleeding through control. She leaned in close to Margaret, her voice low enough to be intimate. "This isn't over," she said. Margaret looked up at her, calm, steady. "I know." As the attendant walked away, Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle fully into her chest. Not fear, not defeat. Certainty. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, beyond the careful choreography of authority and compliance, a truth had been set in motion. It did not need volume. It did not need permission. It only needed time. And time, Margaret knew better than most, had a way of revealing exactly who people were. The first jolt came with the descent, a subtle dip that pulled at Margaret's stomach and reminded everyone they were no longer suspended beyond consequence. The cabin lights brightened, window shades lifted in uneven waves. Outside, the coastline emerged beneath a veil of cloud, grey water cut by white lines of wake and motion. Margaret had not slept. Her throat still burned. The stain on her tray table had dried into a dull, sticky shadow no one had bothered to address. She wiped her hands with a tissue from her purse, folded it carefully, and placed it back where it belonged. Order mattered, even now. Across the aisle, a man stood and stretched, glancing at her briefly before looking away. A woman farther back whispered to her companion, her tone sharp with certainty, as if she had already decided who Margaret was and what she deserved. Margaret listened without reacting. She had learned long ago that reaction was often used as evidence against you. The lead attendant walked the aisle one last time, posture rigid, eyes scanning. When she reached Margaret's row, she stopped. "Remain seated after landing," she said. Not a request, an instruction. Margaret looked up slowly. "Why?" "We need to clarify a few things." Margaret nodded once. "I'd like that clarification in writing." The attendant's mouth tightened. "You'll receive whatever documentation is appropriate." The plane touched down with a firm thud, tires screaming briefly, before surrendering to friction. Applause scattered through the cabin, light and automatic. Margaret did not clap. She watched the wing flex as the aircraft slowed, felt the weight of gravity return fully, felt the moment sharpen. When the seatbelt sign went dark, people surged into the aisle. Bags were pulled free, voices rose. Relief spread quickly, as if the last several hours had already been rewritten in everyone's mind as acceptable inconvenience. Margaret stayed seated. Passengers filed past her, some glancing openly, others pretending not to see. A woman in her 70s paused briefly, eyes soft with something like regret, then moved on without a word. Margaret wondered how many times that woman had chosen silence in her own life, how often she had convinced herself it was safer. Soon the cabin emptied. The noise receded. The hum changed. Margaret was alone now with the crew. Two security officers stepped inside, not hurried, not aggressive. Their shoes made measured sounds against the cabin floor. One of them, taller, held a tablet. The other scanned the space with practiced neutrality. The lead attendant spoke first. "This passenger was disruptive during the flight," she said. "We received multiple complaints. She refused to follow instructions." Margaret stood slowly. She did not rush. She did not speak over anyone. "I requested water," she said. "I requested assistance with a spill. I was ignored. When I asked to speak with the lead attendant, I was threatened with documentation and security." The taller officer raised an eyebrow. "Did she raise her voice?" "No," the attendant said after a beat. "But she was confrontational." Margaret met the officer's eyes. "I asked for basic service." The officer glanced at his partner. "Any safety concerns?" "No," the attendant said. "But then this is not a security matter," the officer said. His voice was calm, final. "If there's a customer complaint, it goes through the airline." The lead attendant's jaw clenched. "We need to search her carry-on. There were concerns about equipment." Margaret felt a flicker of anger then, sharp and clean. "My equipment is medical," she said, "and it was cleared at departure." The officer hesitated. Do you have documentation? Margaret reached into her purse and removed a folder. Inside, everything was where it should be. Licenses, conference credentials, letters. She handed it over without flourish. The officer scanned quickly. His expression changed, just slightly. Everything appears in order. He handed the folder back. You're free to go, ma'am. The lead attendant's eyes flashed. We'll be filing a report. Margaret nodded. So will I. She picked up her bag. Her hands were steady now. The exhaustion remained, but beneath it ran something firmer. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the air felt cooler, heavier. She walked a few steps, then stopped. At the far end stood a man she knew better than anyone. Richard Collins did not rush toward her. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, tall and still, silver hair neat, eyes locked on her face. He had seen the security officers. He had seen the lead attendant's posture, the way the crew lingered too close, the way Margaret carried herself like someone bracing against more than gravity. Margaret's composure broke then, quietly, not with sobs, with a single breath that caught and would not release. Richard closed the distance between them in long, deliberate strides. He took her hands in his, warm and solid. "My queen," he said softly. The words meant only for her. "What did they do to you?" The lead attendant stepped forward, her voice suddenly bright. "Mr. Collins, I didn't realize." Richard turned his head slowly. His expression changed, the warmth vanished, replaced by something colder, sharper, absolute. "You knew exactly who she was," he said. Not loud, not angry. Certain. You just decided it didn't matter. Silence fell hard. Richard reached into his jacket and removed his phone. "Effective immediately," he said, eyes never leaving the crew. "You are suspended from duty. Security will escort you from the aircraft. An investigation begins now." The lead attendant's face drained of color. "Sir, this isn't how—" "It is," Richard said. "It is now." He turned back to Margaret, his voice softening again. "You don't have to explain anything. I saw enough." Margaret looked at him, her eyes shining, not with tears, but with recognition. She had endured the flight. She had held the line. She had not disappeared. Behind them, the machinery of consequence began to move. And for the first time since Gate C-12, Margaret felt something lift. Not because she had been rescued, but because she had been seen. The jet bridge emptied quickly after that. Security moved with quiet efficiency, guiding the crew away, their protests muted by the narrow corridor and the weight of authority they could no longer challenge. The sound of rolling suitcases returned, distant now, as if the airport itself were breathing again. Margaret stood beside Richard, her hand still in his, feeling the aftershock settle through her body like a delayed tremor. Richard did not follow the crew. He did not need to. He watched until they were out of sight, then turned fully toward Margaret. His gaze softened, but his jaw remained set, the way it did when a board decision had already been made, and no argument could change it. "Walk with me," he said. They moved down the jet bridge together. The camera above them blinked red. Richard noticed it and did not look away. He wanted it to see him, wanted it to remember this angle, this moment, this choice. Margaret felt the steadiness of his stride beside hers, felt how deliberately he slowed to match her pace. No rushing, no rescuing, just presence. At the threshold of the terminal, Richard stopped. He turned to face her fully now, blocking the flow of foot traffic without apology. People passed around them, glancing, then moving on. To most, they were just another couple reunited after a flight. To Margaret, this was the first moment she could feel everything she had held back press against her ribs. "They treated me like I was invisible," she said. Her voice was low, controlled, but the words were heavy. Like I didn't belong anywhere near them. Richard nodded. I know. They weren't loud about it, she continued. That's what made it worse. It was quiet, polite, clean. That's how it survives, he said. Margaret looked at him then, really looked, searching his face for doubt, for hesitation, for the instinct to soften what had happened. She found none, only resolve. Do you remember what you said to me when we first met? She asked. Richard smiled faintly. You asked me not to interrupt you while you were finishing your coffee. She almost smiled back. Almost. You said institutions don't change because they feel bad. They change because they're forced to. Yes, he said. And today, they will be. He reached into his pocket again, but this time he did not pull out his phone. He pulled out a small leather notebook, worn at the edges. Margaret recognized it immediately. He carried it when decisions mattered. He opened it, wrote one line, closed it. That's 4 names, he said. Suspension pending termination. No desk duty, no quiet transfers. They're off the schedule starting now. Margaret exhaled slowly. Not relief, confirmation. And the rest? She asked. Richard's eyes lifted toward the terminal ceiling, toward the cameras, toward the idea of a system that believed it could hide behind procedure. The rest will come in layers. Policy review, independent audit, external oversight. That takes time, Margaret said. Yes, he replied. And time is something they've already taken from you. A man in a dark suit approached, earpiece visible, expression cautious. Mr. Collins, he said. Legal is standing by. Operations too. Richard did not look at him. Good. The man hesitated, then glanced at Margaret. Mom, I'm very sorry for... Margaret raised a hand. Not sharply, just enough. The man stopped. I don't need apologies, she said. I need this to not happen again. Richard finally turned to the man. It won't, he said. Not here. They moved again, this time toward a quieter corridor. Margaret felt the exhaustion catch up with her now, a heaviness in her shoulders, a dull ache behind her eyes. Richard noticed immediately. He always did. You should sit, he said. I will, she replied. After this. He nodded. They stopped beside a long window overlooking the runway. Planes taxied past, white bodies gleaming under grey light. Margaret watched one lift into the air, graceful and indifferent. I almost spoke up earlier, she said, on the plane. Richard waited. I didn't, she continued, because I knew what would happen if I did. I've lived that version of the story too many times. Richard's reflection stared back at him in the glass. You shouldn't have to choose between dignity and safety. But we do, Margaret said. Every day. He turned toward her, his expression fierce now, unguarded. Then that's the part that changes. Margaret studied him. The man she had built a life with. The man who understood systems not as abstractions, but as levers. You can't fix everything, she said. No, he agreed. But I can make this expensive. A beat passed, then another. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly. Not because justice had arrived, but because consequence had. Richard took her hand again. Let's go, he said. There's a car waiting. As they walked away from the window, the airport continued its rhythm around them. Flights departed, announcements echoed. Somewhere, reports were already being written, statements drafted, timelines assembled. The story was no longer confined to a cabin in the sky. It had touched the ground. The car waited exactly where Richard said it would. Black, unmarked, engine running. The driver did not ask questions. He opened the door, nodded once, and closed it behind them with a soft, deliberate click that sealed the outside world at bay. For the first time since the gate, Margaret let her head rest back against the seat. The city slid past the window in slow motion. Concrete, glass, motion without meaning. Her hands trembled now, just slightly, the way they always did when adrenaline finally lost its grip. Richard noticed. He always noticed. "You don't have to hold it together anymore," he said quietly. Margaret did not answer right away. She watched a plane lift off in the distance, its nose cutting through the low clouds. "I know," she said finally. "I just don't know what happens when I stop." Richard nodded. He did not fill the silence. He understood that some pauses were necessary, not empty. The car merged onto the freeway. Traffic thickened. Horns blared somewhere far behind them. Life went on, oblivious and relentless. Richard's phone vibrated once, then again. He ignored it. Margaret reached into her purse and removed the folded letter, the same one she had carried all day. She smoothed it out on her lap, not because she needed to read it, but because the act itself grounded her. Dates, times, names. Everything had been clear. Everything had been earned. "They kept telling me to be patient," she said, as if patience was the same as compliance. Richard's jaw tightened. That word gets used like a leash. "They weren't angry," Margaret continued. "That's what scares me. They were calm, efficient, certain." "Certainty is dangerous when it isn't questioned," Richard said. "That's why systems fail quietly before they collapse." His phone vibrated again. This time he answered. "Yes," he said. "No, not later. Now." A pause. His eyes hardened. "Because every minute you wait becomes another excuse." He ended the call. Margaret studied his face. She saw the shift she had seen only a handful of times before. The moment when compassion stepped aside and responsibility took over. When feeling gave way to action. "They're convening an emergency review board," he said. "Independent members, external oversight, not company loyalists." "That won't make you popular," Margaret said. "I didn't build this to be liked," he replied. "I built it to last." The car slowed at a light. A man on the sidewalk glanced in, curious, then looked away. Margaret wondered how many people passed moments like this every day without knowing how close they were to someone else's breaking point. Richard turned slightly toward her. "I need you to tell me everything. Not for punishment, for accuracy." Margaret nodded. "I've been keeping notes." "I know," he said. "That's why they won't be able to lie." She inhaled deeply, then began. She spoke of the gate, the delay, the language that sounded harmless until it wasn't. She described the drink cart passing her seat, the call light ignored, the word disruptive used like a weapon. She did not embellish. She did not editorialize. She spoke the way she always did when facts mattered more than feelings. Richard listened without interruption. His hands remained still, his breathing steady. But his eyes darkened with each detail, not with rage, but with recognition. When she finished, the car had pulled into a quiet driveway lined with trees. A private residence, temporary, secure. Richard did not move to get out. "Do you know why this will matter?" he asked. Margaret looked at him. "Because you're in a position to do something." "Yes," he said. "But more than that." He paused. "Because you did everything right." Margaret felt the words land harder than anything else that day. She looked away quickly, afraid of what might surface if she didn't. "I shouldn't have to be perfect to be treated decently," she said. "No," Richard agreed. "But when you are, and they still fail, there's nowhere left for them to hide." They stepped out of the car. The air was cooler here, quieter, the kind of quiet that allowed thoughts to echo. Inside, Richard loosened his tie and placed it carefully on the table, as if even now order mattered. Margaret sank into a chair, the weight finally settling fully into her body. She felt hollow and heavy at the same time. A knock sounded at the door. One of Richard's senior advisors entered, tablet in hand, expression grave. "Footage has been secured," he said. "Cabin audio too, no gaps." Richard nodded. "Good. The union has been notified. Legal is advising immediate suspension pending termination." "Advising?" Richard repeated. "Yes." "Then advise them back," Richard said evenly. "Suspension stands." The advisor hesitated. "There will be pushback." "There always is," Richard replied. "That's how you know you're touching something real." The advisor glanced at Margaret, then back to Richard. "Public relations is asking how you want to position this." Richard's gaze flicked to Margaret. He waited. Margaret straightened slightly. "I don't want a statement that makes this sound rare," she said. "And I don't want one that makes me exceptional." The advisor nodded slowly. "Understood." "I want it framed as what it was," Margaret continued. "A failure. One that happens because people think silence is neutrality." Richard felt something like pride rise in his chest. "That's exactly how it will be framed." The advisor left. Margaret closed her eyes. The exhaustion was deeper now, layered, reaching places she hadn't realized were still raw. She thought of the younger version of herself again, of all the moments she had swallowed anger to survive. Richard knelt in front of her, his voice softer now. "You didn't imagine any of it," he said, "and you didn't overreact." "I know," she replied, "but knowing doesn't erase it." "No," he said, "but it gives us direction." Outside, a plane roared overhead, unseen but undeniable. Margaret opened her eyes. She felt bruised, but she felt anchored. The day had not broken her. It had revealed something. This was no longer just her story. It was about to become theirs. Night fell without ceremony. No dramatic sunset, just the gradual dimming of light as the city outside the windows slipped into shadow. Margaret sat at the small dining table, a mug of tea cooling between her hands. She hadn't taken a sip. The steam had long since disappeared, leaving only the faint scent of chamomile and something sharper underneath it she couldn't name. Richard stood a few feet away, jacket off now, sleeves rolled to the forearms. He had not sat down. He hadn't needed to. The room carried the same tension as a boardroom moments before a decisive vote. Quiet, expectant. His phone rang. He answered without looking at the screen. Yes. A pause. His eyes lifted slightly, unfocused, listening. "No," he said. "That's not an option." Another pause. Longer this time. "I understand the implications," Richard continued. "What I'm telling you is that they don't outweigh the facts." Margaret watched him carefully. Not the words, the restraint behind them. This was not anger. This was discipline. The kind that came from years of being the last voice in the room when everyone else wanted delay. "Yes," Richard said. "I'm aware of the union language." He turned slightly, giving Margaret his back now, the way he always did when the conversation required precision. "Then let them grieve the process, and not sacrificing accountability to preserve comfort." He ended the call. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "They're trying to slow it down," Margaret said quietly. "Yes," Richard replied. "They're hoping time will dull the edges." She nodded. "It usually works." "Not this time." He crossed the room and sat across from her for the first time since they'd arrived. The chair creaked softly under his weight. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped. "I need to tell you something before this moves any further," he said. Margaret looked up. "Tell me." "There are cameras everywhere on those planes," Richard continued. "But people forget the microphones. They forget the offhand comments, the things they say when they think no one important is listening." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "You heard them?" "Yes." He didn't soften it, didn't protect her from the truth. He never had. "They talked about you like you weren't human," he said. Not loudly, casually, like it was settled fact. Margaret closed her eyes. The words landed, heavy but unsurprising. "That's always how it is," she said. "It's never dramatic. It's administrative." Richard nodded, which is why this can't be handled quietly. He reached into his pocket and placed his phone on the table between them. "By morning, this will be public." Margaret opened her eyes. "You're sure?" "Yes. There will be backlash. There always is." She exhaled slowly. "I don't want revenge." "I know." "I don't want their names dragged for spectacle." "I know." "What I want," Margaret said, choosing each word carefully, "is for someone like them to hesitate next time. Just for a second. Long enough to remember there's a cost." Richard watched her, the woman he had loved for decades, the woman who had learned to survive without demanding acknowledgement. "That's exactly what this will do," he said. Another phone call came through almost immediately. Richard glanced at the screen this time, then answered. "Yes." A voice crackled faintly from the speaker. Urgent, controlled. "Release the footage," Richard said. "Unedited." A pause. "No," he continued. "Context isn't the problem. Behavior is." Margaret felt a shiver run through her arms. She wrapped her hands around the mug, grounding herself in the ceramic's coolness. "Let them see it," Richard said. "All of it." He ended the call. The silence that followed was different now. Not heavy. Charged. Margaret stood and moved toward the window. Below, the city lights stretched outward, indifferent and vast. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the faint vibration of life beyond it. "I used to think dignity meant enduring quietly," she said. "That if I stayed calm enough, careful enough, eventually I'd be safe." Richard came to stand beside her. "You were safe," he said. "You just weren't protected." She turned toward him. "There's a difference." "Yes." They stood there together, framed by glass and shadow, as the machinery of exposure began to turn somewhere far beyond the room. Emails drafted, calls made, files prepared for release. Margaret felt fear then, not of being disbelieved, but of being seen. Richard seemed to sense it. "You won't be alone in this," he said. She nodded. "I know." Outside, a helicopter passed overhead, its lights sweeping briefly across the buildings before disappearing. The world moved on, unaware that a story was about to break open, not with shouting or spectacle, but with evidence. And once it did, there would be no quiet way back. The story broke before dawn. Margaret woke to the soft vibration of Richard's phone on the nightstand, steady and insistent, like a pulse that refused to be ignored. The room was still dark, the city outside quiet in that brief window before morning reclaimed it. Richard reached for the phone without a word. He did not need to look at the screen to know what it was. "It's live," he said after a moment. Margaret sat up slowly. Her body felt heavy, as if the night had pressed down on her bones. "Already?" "They didn't wait," Richard replied. "They never do." He turned the phone toward her. The screen glowed. Headlines scrolled past in sharp, unforgiving lines. Video thumbnails. still frames frozen at the worst moments. Her standing alone in the aisle. The lead attendant's face caught mid-sentence. The empty seat beside her, a visual accusation no caption needed to explain. Margaret looked, but she did not flinch. "This isn't how I wanted people to see me," she said quietly. Richard shook his head. "This is how they treated you. There's a difference." By the time the sun crept through the curtains, the reaction had already begun. Calls stacked up, messages flooded in. Some from colleagues who recognized her immediately, voices thick with anger and shame. Some from strangers who said nothing about her profession, only about how familiar the moment felt. "I thought it was just me. I thought I was imagining it. I stopped flying because of this." Margaret listened to every message. She did not respond to most of them. She didn't trust herself to speak yet. In the early hours, Richard's legal team arrived, quiet and efficient, laptops opening like instruments on a sterile table. They spoke in measured tones. Exposure, liability, precedent. Words Margaret had heard all her life, now orbiting her experience as if it were a case study instead of a wound. One of them hesitated before speaking. "There's significant public pressure already," he said. "People are demanding immediate termination." Richard's answer was calm. "They're already suspended. Termination follows process." Margaret looked up sharply. "Process matters," she said. The room paused. "Yes," Richard agreed. "It does. That's why we're following it." By mid-morning, the footage had spread far beyond the airline's reach. It played on news channels between weather updates and market reports. Commentators spoke with practiced concern. Some called it unacceptable. Others called it unfortunate. A few questioned whether it had been misunderstood. Margaret watched one of those segments in silence. A man her own age leaned into a camera and said, "We don't know the full context." She turned off the screen. "I'm tired of context," she said. "Context is where truth goes to hide." Richard did not argue. Late that afternoon, Margaret stepped outside alone for the first time. The air was cool, the sidewalk warm beneath her shoes. A woman walking her dog slowed as she passed, recognition flickering across her face. She smiled gently, uncertain. Margaret nodded back. That was when it hit her. Not the anger, not the fear. The weight. She leaned against the low brick wall outside the building and closed her eyes. Her chest tightened. Her breathing shortened. For a moment, the world narrowed to sound and sensation. The distant traffic, the bark of the dog, her own pulse, loud in her ears. She had carried herself through the flight, through the confrontation, through the exposure. Now her body was catching up. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest and breathed, slow and deliberate, the way she had taught patients to do when panic threatened to overwhelm them. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Again. Richard appeared beside her without speaking, placing a steady hand at the center of her back, not holding her up, just there. "I don't regret it," she said after a long moment. "I know," he replied. "But I didn't realize how tired I was," she admitted. He nodded. "Most people don't until they stop running." They stood together as the afternoon light shifted, shadows stretching longer across the pavement. Somewhere nearby, a radio played softly. A voice mentioned her name again, this time paired with words like dignity and courage. Margaret felt a quiet sadness settle in her chest. Not because of what had happened to her, but because it had taken this much for people to see it. She straightened slowly. Her spine ached, but it held. "This can't just be a moment," she said. "It has to change something." Richard met her gaze. "It will. Not because people are good. Because they're watching." Margaret thought of the woman at the gate who had almost spoken up. Of the passengers who had looked away. Of the younger attendant in the galley who had said nothing. Watching mattered. As evening approached, Margaret returned inside. The day had taken something from her, but it had also stripped something away. A long-held illusion that silence was protection. She was not healed, but she was no longer invisible. And that, she knew, would change everything that came next. The room was silent when Margaret stepped onto the stage. Not the polite silence of courtesy, but the heavier kind that comes when people already know they are about to be confronted with something uncomfortable. The auditorium lights washed the crowd in a soft amber glow, catching silver hair, folded hands, straight backs. Many of them were her age or older. Men and women who had lived long enough to recognize injustice not as theory, but as memory. Margaret paused at the podium, resting her palms on the wood, feeling the faint vibration of her own pulse travel upward into her fingers. She did not open with gratitude. She did not open with credentials. She opened with truth. On a flight not long ago, she said, voice steady, measured, I was treated as if my presence itself was a problem that needed to be managed. A murmur rippled through the room, restrained but unmistakable. Margaret continued, each word deliberate, grounded. She spoke of silence, of procedures used as shields, of how dignity can be denied without a single raised voice. She did not name the airline. She did not name the individuals. She did not need to. The story had already moved far beyond them. In the front row, Richard sat motionless, hands clasped loosely in his lap, eyes fixed on her. He had sat through earnings calls that decided the fate of thousands, through negotiations that shifted entire markets. But this was different. This was not about control. This was about witness. Margaret spoke of endurance, of how people were taught to survive by shrinking, of how age did not insulate you from being questioned, only from being surprised by it. Her voice did not crack. It did not need to. The weight of decades carried it forward. When people tell you to be patient, she said, what they often mean is, be quiet. The silence deepened. Somewhere in the back, someone nodded slowly. She finished without applause, not because the audience did not want to clap, but because the moment demanded stillness first. When the applause finally came, it was not explosive. It was sustained, steady, respectful, the kind that lingered after the sound faded. Backstage, Margaret leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. The exhaustion was still there, but it no longer felt like collapse. It felt like release. Richard joined her a moment later, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. No words. None were needed. Outside the hall, cameras waited. Reporters called her name. She walked past them calmly, not out of fear, but out of choice. She had said what mattered to the people who needed to hear it most. The rest could catch up. Over the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded with less spectacle, but greater permanence. The investigation concluded. The suspensions became terminations, not announced with drama, but documented with precision. Policies were rewritten, not as press statements, but as binding procedures. New reporting channels were created, staffed by people trained not just to listen, but to act. Quiet changes, structural changes, the kind that rarely trend, but endure. Margaret returned to Detroit, to her hospital, to her patients. The first day back, a young nurse hesitated outside her office, then knocked softly. I saw you, she said, eyes shining with something like relief. Margaret smiled gently. So did I, she replied. Life did not become easier overnight. Margaret still noticed the looks, the assumptions, the pauses that came before respect. But something fundamental had shifted. She no longer carried the burden alone. Others carried it with her now, whether they realized it or not. One evening, months later, Margaret and Richard sat on their porch as dusk settled over the neighborhood. The air was cool, the sounds familiar. A neighbor waved as he passed, genuine warmth in the gesture. Margaret watched the sky darken slowly, thinking of how long she had believed that endurance was the same as strength. "I used to think surviving was the goal," she said quietly. Richard nodded. "And now?" "Now I think being seen is." He reached for her hand, squeezing once, firm and grounding. They sat in silence as the streetlights flickered on, one by one. Somewhere, a woman boarded a flight and felt something different. Somewhere, a man paused before dismissing a complaint. Somewhere, a silence was broken not by outrage, but by refusal. Margaret did not call it victory. She called it movement. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more stories that matter, and leave your thoughts below using 3 simple words.